I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sound of my life being bartered away was not a crash of thunder, but the low, conspiratorial murmur of my father's voice, threaded with the silken, steel-sharp tones of my stepmother, Beatrice. They spoke of me as one might speak of a problematic piece of furniture, awkwardly shaped, of no discernible beauty, and occupying a space that could be better used. I was Eleanor, the plain second daughter, the quiet one, the shadow that trailed my luminous younger sister, Rosamond. And Rosamond, in her infinite, thoughtless beauty, had just sealed my doom by eloping with a penniless lieutenant, leaving behind a chasm of debt and a furious duke who had been promised a bride. I was to be the substitute payment. My father's finances, a house of cards built on foolish wagers and lavish living, had finally collapsed. The final creditor, the one who held the deed to our very home, was the Duke of Alastair, a man whose name was a whisper in drawing rooms, a figure of remote, formidable power. He was a creature of myth, a recluse who had not been seen in society since the death of his young wife years ago. He lived in a fortress of grief and wealth called Blackwood Manor, and he had, it seemed, agreed to forgive my father's ruinous debt in exchange for a wife, for Rosamond. But with Rosamond gone, the offering had to be changed. The offering was now me. "She is quiet, at least," Beatrice had said, a statement meant not as a compliment but as a confirmation of my manageability. "She will not cause him any trouble, and he is hardly in a position to be particular, shut away as he is. One bride is as good as another for a man who only wants an heir." I did not weep. The capacity for easy tears had been schooled out of me long ago. Instead, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. I was not to be sent to the Grand Manor, not as a prospective duchess. I was to be installed in a derelict cottage on the farthest edge of his estate, a place called Stone End, to await his inspection. I was a horse being sent to a new master, left in the paddock to be looked over. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy cloak I could not shrug off. I packed my few belongings, my worn books, my mother's silver locket, the plain gray and brown dresses that were the uniform of my invisibility, and I did not say a proper goodbye. One does not bid farewell when one is being evicted. Stone End Cottage was aptly named. It felt like the end of everything. It was damp, smelling of wet stone and seasons of disuse. A fine layer of grime covered every surface, and the wind moaned through ill-fitting window frames. For 3 days I worked. I scrubbed floors until my knees were raw. I fought with a stubborn flu until a small, smoky fire consented to burn in the hearth, and I washed the single set of grimy linens in a bucket of icy water from the well. I was trying to scrub away the shame, to impose some order on the chaos of my new reality. It was on the 4th day, as I stood on a rickety chair trying to wipe the grime from a window pane, that he arrived. I did not hear his approach. The first I knew of him was a shadow falling across the floor, eclipsing the weak afternoon light. I turned, startled, my heart leaping into my throat. He stood in the open doorway, a man carved from the very granite of his estate. The Duke of Alastair was taller than I had imagined, broader of shoulder, his presence so immense it seemed to diminish the small room around him. His hair was dark, his face a collection of severe, handsome lines that gave nothing away. He was dressed in impeccable, unadorned black, as if still in mourning not only for his wife, but for the world itself. His eyes, a startling, cold gray, swept the room with a look of faint distaste, then landed on me. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman's gaze, but a direct, analytical assessment. He took in my smudged cheek, my worn dress, my hands, red and chapped from lye soap. I saw the flicker of confusion, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He had been expecting Rosamond, a creature of spun gold and rose petals. He had received me, a gray sparrow. I felt a flush of heat crawl up my neck, but I held my ground, my hand still clutching a damp rag. I would not cower. I had nothing left to lose but the last vestiges of my dignity. "You are not her," he said. His voice was a low baritone, as cold and clear as the water from the well. It was not a question. "No, Your Grace," I replied, my own voice steadier than I felt. My sister was unavailable. I expected dismissal, perhaps a quiet, contemptuous instruction for me to be sent back. Instead, he took a step into the room, his gaze moving from my face to the small, valiant fire in the hearth, the neatly stacked books on the mantel, the clean, bare floorboards. His eyes lingered on the books. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. Then he looked at me again, and this time, the look was different. The cold assessment was gone, replaced by something I could not name. It was a deep, unsettling focus, as if he were trying to read the lines of a difficult text. He was not looking at the debtor's plain daughter, the substitute bride. He was looking at me, Eleanor Vance, the person standing on a chair in a dusty cottage. It was the first time in my life a man of consequence had ever truly seen me, and it was as terrifying as it was revolutionary. He did not speak again. He simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, turned on his heel, and was gone. The shadow retreated and the pale light returned, but the room felt irrevocably altered. He had left the echo of his presence behind, a charge in the air that made the small space feel both emptier and more significant than it had a moment before. I slowly climbed down from the chair, my legs trembling. I did not know what that look had meant, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my life had just been cleaved in two. The long, gray years of being invisible before, and whatever was to come now. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. I expected a summons, a dismissal, a decision of some kind. None came. There was only silence from the great house on the hill. But then, small things began to change. One morning, I opened the door to find a neat stack of seasoned oak logs on my doorstep, dry and ready for the fire. A few days later, a thick, woolen shawl, the color of heather, was draped over the gatepost. There was never a note, never a messenger. The gifts appeared as if by magic, practical and anonymous. I knew their source. These were not the flamboyant gestures of a suitor, but the quiet, considered actions of a man who paid attention. He had seen the pathetic pile of damp kindling I had gathered. He had likely seen me shivering as I drew water from the well. The thought that his severe, remote gaze had lingered on me long enough to notice such details was a profoundly disconcerting one. He began to visit. His appearances were always framed by the practicalities of his ducal duties. He would ride up, ostensibly to inspect a crumbling stone wall that bordered the cottage garden, or to consult a map of the estate's drainage. But his business would inevitably conclude, and he would turn to me where I stood in the doorway, a silent observer of his lordship's work. His questions started simply. He asked about the cottage's well, the integrity of the roof, whether the chimney drew properly. I answered him with the same direct, unadorned honesty with which I did everything. Then the questions shifted. He had noticed my small stack of books. "You are a reader, Miss Vance," he stated one afternoon, his gray eyes fixed on the worn spine of a book of philosophy I had left on the windowsill. I admitted that I was. "And what do you find in Marcus Aurelius?" he asked, his tone neutral, yet I sensed a genuine curiosity beneath the formal surface. Our first real conversation was not about the weather or social niceties, but about Stoic philosophy, standing in the cold sunlight with the smell of damp earth around us. I spoke of finding solace in the idea of an inner citadel, a fortress of the mind that external circumstances could not breach. As I spoke, I felt that intense, focused gaze on me again, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise, perhaps, but recognition. The visits became more frequent, the pretenses thinner. One day, he did not even bother with the excuse of estate business. He simply appeared at my door, and with a stiff formality that I was beginning to understand masked a kind of shyness, he said, "The library at Blackwood is considered one of the finest in the county. I find myself in want of a conversation about a recent acquisition. Perhaps you would do me the honor of joining me for tea?" It was an invitation that changed everything. To be asked to the manor, not as a supplicant or a piece of property, but as a guest, an intellectual equal. The walk to the great house was a blur. I was acutely aware of my plain brown dress, of my status as the daughter of a ruined man. But the moment I stepped into his library, my anxieties dissolved. It was a cathedral of books. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with the scent of old paper and leather. A fire blazed in a fireplace large enough to stand in, and long, slanted ribbons of light fell from the tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. It felt like coming home. "It is overwhelming at first," he said, his voice softer in this quiet space. "It is magnificent," I breathed, my hand hovering over a row of leather-bound volumes, as if I could absorb their contents through touch alone. Our conversations over tea that afternoon, and in the many afternoons that followed, were a revelation. We spoke of poetry and crop rotation, of Roman history and the challenges of managing the estate's tenant farms. He listened to my opinions with a gravity and respect no one, least of all my own family, had ever afforded them. I learned that the cold, severe Duke of Allister possessed a sharp, dry wit, and a mind that was as ordered and impressive as his library. He learned, I think, that I was more than a quiet, plain girl. I had a mind of my own, and it was a thing he seemed to find not intimidating, but fascinating. One afternoon, we were standing before a high shelf, discussing a particular translation of Ovid. He reached for the volume at the same moment I did. His fingers, long and warm, brushed against mine. A jolt, sharp and startling, shot up my arm. I snatched my hand back as if burned. The air between us grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken awareness that had nothing to do with classical poetry. He did not move, his hand still hovering in the air. His gaze dropped to my face, and his gray eyes were dark, intense. I could hear my own heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, until it was broken by the distant chime of a clock. He slowly lowered his hand, a muscle working in his jaw. A few days later, as I was preparing to leave the library, he stopped me. He stood before me, blocking my path, the setting sun at his back casting him in silhouette. "Eleanor," he said, and the use of my given name was as shocking as a shout. My name, which had always sounded so plain and serviceable, sounded different on his tongue, resonant, significant. "My name is Allister. I would consider it a kindness if you would use it." It was not a request. It was a quiet command, a dismantling of the formal barriers between us. A key turning in a lock I had not known was there. "Allister," I whispered, testing the shape of the name. It felt momentous, a step across a threshold from which there could be no return. In that quiet library, surrounded by the silent witness of 1,000 books, something new was being written. A story I had never dared to imagine for myself. But hope, I was learning, was a dangerous and fragile thing, and the foundations of our tentative connection were built on a truth I did not yet understand. The invoice for all this unexpected kindness was about to arrive. The letter came on a Tuesday, delivered by a sullen boy from the village. It bore my father's seal. I felt a familiar dread as I broke the wax. His letters were never missives of fatherly affection. They were instruments of demand or complaint. This one was different. It was triumphant. He wrote not to me, but through me, addressing the Duke. He spoke of his pleasure that I had found favor with his grace, and that the final arrangements could now be concluded. He was enclosing, for the Duke's final signature, a copy of the marriage contract they had negotiated. He trusted it would be found satisfactory. My hands trembled as I unfolded the second document. I read through the dense legal language, the clauses and sub-clauses detailing the transfer of my person in exchange for the cancellation of debt. It was a cold, transactional document, and I felt the familiar sting of shame. But then I saw it. Tucked away in the latter half of the document was a clause of such breathtaking cruelty that the air left my lungs in a painful rush. It stipulated that should I, Eleanor Vance, fail to produce a male heir within 2 years of the marriage, a significant portion of my father's ancestral lands Alistair had acquired as part of the debt settlement, would be forfeited and returned to my father's estate. The room tilted. The words blurred on the page, but their meaning was seared into my mind. I was not just a bride. I was not just a payment. I was a vessel. A means to an end. My worth was contingent on my fertility, a gamble my father was taking to reclaim what he had lost. And Alistair knew. He must have known. This contract was negotiated between them. A wave of nausea washed over me. Every kindness, every shared conversation, every thoughtful gesture was instantly recontextualized. The firewood was not a gift. It was an investment in the health of his asset. The books were not an offering to a fellow mind. They were a way to gentle a nervous mare before putting her to stud. The use of his name, the charged moments in the library, they were all part of a calculated effort to ensure my compliance. The fragile seedling of hope that had begun to grow in the barren soil of my heart withered and died, turning to bitter ash in my mouth. He had not seen me. He had only ever seen a solution to a problem, a womb to secure his legacy and finalize a business deal. I did not storm or weep. My pain was a cold, quiet thing. I folded the letter and the contract, my movements precise and deliberate. I put on the heather-colored shawl he had left for me, and I walked to Blackwood Manor. I did not wait to be announced. I walked past a startled footman and straight to the library. He was there, standing by the window, looking out at the rain that had begun to fall. He turned as I entered, a rare, small smile touching his lips. The smile vanished when he saw my face. "Eleanor? What is it?" I did not speak. I walked to the great mahogany desk that stood in the center of the room, and I laid the contract down on its polished surface, smoothing the creases with a cold hand. I looked at him, my gaze level and unblinking. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to read the accusation in my eyes. He looked from my face to the papers. He picked up the contract, his expression unreadable as he scanned the document he surely already knew by heart. When he reached the clause, I saw a flicker in his jaw, the only sign of any emotion. He placed the paper back on the desk with quiet finality. "My father seems to believe this is a settled matter," I said, my voice devoid of inflection. It was a marvel, I thought, with a strange sense of detachment, that I could speak at all. "He seems to believe you are in agreement with these terms." "This was the initial agreement between your father and my solicitors," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is a despicable document." "And yet it exists," I countered, a tremor finally entering my voice. "And you did not see fit to inform me of its contents. Was I ever to be told? Or was I simply to be married off, a broodmare with a deadline?" The words tasted like poison. He took a step toward me, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "All of it," I whispered, the cold calm finally breaking. "The conversations, the books. Was it all just husbandry? A way to ensure your investment was sound?" "No." The word was sharp, emphatic. He moved around the desk until he was standing before me, close enough that I could see the storm gathering in his gray eyes. "Eleanor, look at me." I forced myself to meet his gaze. The man who made that agreement was a man buried in bitterness and duty. He sought a practical solution to a foolish man's debt. He intended to acquire a wife, install her in his home, and continue his life as it was. A cold, empty business. That was the plan. He paused, and his voice dropped, becoming raw, vulnerable. I did not plan for you. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. I did not plan for your courage in that wretched cottage. I did not plan for your intelligence, or for a mind that challenges and delights my own. I did not plan for the quiet way you see the world. Everything about you was a catastrophe to my cold, well-ordered plans. That contract, he gestured to the desk, his hand clenched into a fist, was an abomination I intended to burn. But I was a coward. I did not know how to tell you of its existence without you looking at me exactly as you are looking at me now, as if I were a monster. He was not a monster. He was a man, flawed and guarded, and his confession was a crack in the formidable armor he wore. But the hurt was a deep, fresh wound, and I could not yet bring myself to believe. The kindness of powerful men, I had long ago learned, almost always comes with invisible invoices. I stood my ground, the contract on the desk between us a wavering partition of gold and black in the dimming light. His confession, as raw as it was, could be just another tactic, a more sophisticated method of persuasion. Words were air. I needed something more solid, some proof that I was not just another pawn in a game played by men far more powerful than I. My heart, a foolish, trusting thing, wanted desperately to believe him, but my mind, honed by a lifetime of disappointments, demanded evidence. Words are easily spoken, Your Grace, I said, the formal address a deliberate step back, a rebuilding of the wall he had tried to breach. Then do not trust my words, Alistair replied, his voice tight with an emotion I could not quite decipher. He turned from me and walked to a small locked cabinet in the corner of the library. He produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, unlocked it, and withdrew a different set of papers, bound in a dark blue ribbon. He did not hand them to me. He laid them on the desk beside the other contract, a stark contrast in their presentation. My solicitor drew this up 3 days ago, at my instruction, he said, his eyes never leaving my face. It is a new marriage settlement. Read it. With hesitant fingers, I untied the ribbon. The legal language was still dense, but the meaning was clear. The punitive clause regarding an heir was gone, struck entirely. In its place was a clause that deeded the Stone End cottage and 50 acres of surrounding land to me, Eleanor Vance, directly and irrevocably. It was to be mine, with no conditions, not upon marriage, but immediately. It was a grant of independence. It was security. It was a home that no one could take from me. It was a gift of freedom, not a cage. I looked up at him, my throat thick with unshed tears. He had done this before I confronted him. He had seen the trap my father had laid, and he had not only disarmed it, he had built me a fortress against it. This was not the act of a man securing an asset. This was the act of a man trying to protect a woman he valued. You are going to give me a way out, I whispered, the realization dawning on me with the force of a physical blow. You are giving me the choice to leave, to be free of you and my father both. I was giving you what you deserve, he corrected me softly. A place of your own, a life of your own choosing. If you chose to leave, I would not have stopped you. Though, his voice dropped, laced with a profound, aching sincerity. I confess I have been spending every waking hour since I commissioned that document praying you would not. He finally closed the distance between us, his hands coming up to gently cup my face. His touch was not possessive, but reverent. Eleanor, he said, his thumbs stroking my cheeks. For years this house has been a mausoleum. I have been a ghost within its walls, a custodian of a title and a memory. I did my duty, I managed my affairs, but I did not live. And then you arrived, with your quiet strength and your fierce intelligence, and you filled these silent rooms with light. You have unmade me, piece by piece. The thought of you leaving, it is not a prospect I can easily bear. I am asking you not to honor your father's disgusting bargain. I am asking you to stay, as my wife, as my partner, as my equal, as the woman I have, against all logic and intention, come to love. The declaration was not a flowery pronouncement. It was a confession, torn from the deepest part of him. It was the ultimate vulnerability from a man who had armored himself against the world. And in his eyes, I saw not the cold calculation I had feared, but a desperate, hopeful plea. The last of my defenses crumbled. The tears I had held back for so long finally fell, hot and silent. I leaned into his touch, a gesture of surrender and acceptance. "I will stay, Alistair," I said, my voice thick but clear. "I will stay." A long, slow breath escaped him, a sound of profound relief. He did not kiss me then. He simply held me, his forehead resting against mine, as the rain pattered against the library windows, washing the world clean. We were no longer a duke and a debtor's daughter. We were a man and a woman who had found each other in the ruins of a broken bargain, ready to write a new contract of our own. My father and Beatrice arrived a week later, descending upon Blackwood Manor like vultures scenting a victory. They were dressed in their finest, their smiles brittle and triumphant. They clearly believed they were here to witness the final signing of their lucrative agreement, to see their plain daughter successfully wedded and their fortunes restored. They were ushered into the main drawing room, a grand, formal space with gilded ceilings and portraits of Alistair's ancestors judging them from the walls. Alistair and I were waiting for them, standing together before the fireplace. I felt his warmth and solidity beside me, a silent anchor. "Your Grace!" my father boomed, striding forward with his hand outstretched. "A happy day!" A most excellent arrangement for all parties. Beatrice glided behind him, her eyes flicking over me, a flicker of dismissive surprise in them at my composure, at the simple but well-made blue dress I wore, a gift from Alistair's housekeeper, who had quietly taken me under her wing. "Eleanor, you are looking well," she conceded, as if my health were an unexpected bonus. Alistair ignored my father's hand. He remained perfectly still, his expression as unyielding as granite. "There has been a change of plans, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. My father's jovial expression faltered. "A change? I do not understand. The contract is clear, a simple matter of signatures." He gestured toward the desk where a footman had placed a folio. He believed it held his victory. "The contract you proposed was an insult, both to me and to your daughter," Alistair stated, his voice ringing with cold authority. "It will not be signed. Not now, not ever." My father paled. Beatrice's smile froze on her face. "But the debt," my father stammered. "The agreement." "The agreement is null and void," Alistair cut in. He gestured to his solicitor, a small, hawk-nosed man named Mr. Finch, who had been standing discreetly by the door. Mr. Finch stepped forward and placed the new document on the table, the one that gifted me Stone End Cottage. "This is the only binding document that shall be executed today. It ensures Eleanor's independence and security. Her future is her own. It does not belong to you." My father stared at the paper, his face turning a mottled shade of red as he grasped the implications. He had lost. He had overplayed his hand. His desperation turned to fury, and he rounded on me. You did this," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You conniving little wren. You always were a jealous, bitter creature. You have ruined us." For my entire life, I had bowed my head before his anger. I had absorbed the blame and accepted the insults. But I was not that girl anymore. I stood taller, my hand finding Alistair's, his fingers lacing with mine in a gesture of silent, unshakable support. "No, Father," I said, and my voice was calm, clear, and carried across the cavernous room. You ruined yourselves. You ruined yourselves with your greed and your ambition. You saw me not as a daughter, but as a commodity, a piece of property to be traded for your own comfort. You saw Rosamond as an ornament. You never truly saw either of us. I looked from his furious face to Beatrice's mask of cold rage. I am not a wren, and I am not bitter. I am simply finished with being invisible. I will not be the price of your salvation. It was the longest speech I had ever given, and the truest. The words were not born of anger, but of a profound, settled sense of my own worth. A worth Alistair had shown me was there all along. The downfall was swift and absolute. Mr. Finch calmly produced a second set of documents, detailing several other of my father's fraudulent dealings that his investigations had uncovered. The threat of debtor's prison was no longer a distant fear. It was an imminent reality. My father and Beatrice stood there, stripped of their arrogance, their social ambition turning to dust around them. They were defeated. Alistair gave them one last withering look. You will leave this house, and you will not trouble Miss Vance again. They scurried out, their grand exit a pathetic, hurried retreat, leaving behind only the faint, cloying scent of Beatrice's perfume. The silence they left behind was vast and peaceful. The tension drained from the room, from my body, leaving me feeling hollowed out and strangely light. The battle was over. I had won. I had won myself. Later that evening, after the storm of the confrontation had passed, a profound sense of dislocation settled over me. I felt as if I had shed an old skin, and the new one was still tender and unfamiliar. I wandered out onto the stone terrace, the cool, damp air a balm on my heated cheeks. A soft rain had begun to fall again, whispering through the leaves of the ancient oaks that guarded the manor. Alistair found me there, standing by the balustrade, watching the twilight bleed into the gardens. He came to stand beside me, not speaking, simply offering his quiet presence. I turned to him, clutching the beautiful heather-colored shawl he had given me. It felt too heavy now, a reminder of a time when his intentions were a mystery to me. In a sudden, symbolic urge to wipe the slate clean, to start our story anew from this day forward, I began to unwrap it from my shoulders. I should give this back to you, I said, my voice barely a whisper above the rain. And the books. I want nothing that was part of the bargain. I want to start with nothing owed. I held the soft wool out to him. He looked at the shawl in my hands, then back to my face, and a slow, infinitely tender smile touched his lips. He did not take it. Instead, he took my hands, folding them and the shawl between his own. "Eleanor," he said, his voice deep and warm, "those were never part of any bargain. They were for the woman I saw shivering in the cold, for the woman whose mind I wanted to know. They were never for the debtor's daughter. They were always for you." He gently took the shawl from my grasp and draped it back around my shoulders, his fingers lingering on my collarbone. He drew me closer, until there was no space left between us, only the soft wool of the shawl. The rain was falling more steadily now, misting my hair and face, but I did not feel the cold. I felt only the radiating heat of his body, the steady beat of his heart against mine. "There is nothing owed," he murmured, his face lowering to mine. "Only everything freely given." And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion or possession, but a kiss of profound homecoming. It was slow and deep and shaking, a seal on a promise made not with contracts and clauses, but with quiet understanding and a shared love of rainy evenings. It was the taste of rain and resolution, the end of a long, lonely winter and the certain promise of spring. In the shelter of his arms, with the rain washing the world away, I was no longer invisible. I was found. We were married 3 months later in the small, sun-dappled church on the estate grounds. It was a quiet affair, attended only by a few trusted servants and his formidable hawk-eyed aunt, Lady Beatrice, a woman who, after a single, terrifyingly astute conversation with me, had declared me a vast improvement and become my staunchest ally. My sister, Rosamond, sent a letter. It was filled with remorse and a surprising degree of self-awareness. She had found a hard but honest life with her lieutenant, and for the first time, she wished me happiness with a sincerity that I believed. Our life at Blackwood settled into a rhythm of shared purpose and quiet joy. The grand manor, once a place of shadows and silence, now echoed with conversation and, on rare occasions, laughter. The library became the heart of our home, a shared sanctuary where we would spend our evenings reading, debating, or simply sitting in comfortable silence, the firelight glinting on the spines of our silent friends. Alistair was not a man transformed, but a man revealed. The severity was a shield, not a nature, and beneath it was a deep well of kindness, a dry wit, and an unwavering integrity that I trusted above all else. He was my partner in all things, valuing my opinion on estate matters as highly as he did his stewards, and we governed his vast lands together. The Stone End cottage, my former prison, was restored. Alistair had it repaired and refurnished, not as a guest house, but as my private study. It was my own space, a tangible symbol of the independence he had fought to give me. I would go there sometimes to sit by the small hearth and write, the heather shawl draped over my favorite chair. It was a reminder not of a painful beginning, but of the place where a man had first looked past the surface of things and had truly seen the woman beneath. One afternoon, I was in the library, searching for a book on botany, when I found a small, carved wooden horse tucked away on a high shelf, almost hidden from view. It was simple, clearly made by an amateur hand, but worn smooth with time. I took it down just as Alistair entered the room. He stopped when he saw it in my hand, a flicker of old pain in his eyes. "That was my wife's," he said softly. "She carved it, for the child we never had." It was the first time he had ever mentioned her in such a personal way. I did not speak, but carefully placed the small horse on the mantelpiece, in a place of honor beside my own treasured volumes. A quiet acknowledgement of the past that had shaped him, a past that was now part of our shared story. He came and stood behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. We stood like that for a long time, looking at the fire, two solitudes who had found a shared sanctuary, building a future that honored the ghosts of the past without being haunted by them. I had come to his estate as a payment, a shadow meant to be unseen and unheard. I had become its duchess, its heart. Not because I was beautiful or well-born, but because in the quietest, most unexpected of places, a man had listened to my silence and understood it as a language all its own. I had found my voice, my home, and my love, all because I had been seen.